Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. The topic that we're doing on this Activist Tuesday is development and how it impacts the economic opportunities of residents. So, you know, in Sarasota, half of the children in Sarasota County are on a free or reduced lunch. They're eligible for a free or reduced lunch. And so essentially we have many families who are struggling to make ends meet. And according to the United Way, and this is their 2019 report that came out of February of last year, it's called the ALICE data, Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. So these are our working poor in the community. On the west coast of Florida, 43% of working households cannot cover basic needs. So this isn't just, this is a lot of people who are having trouble making ends meet. And you know, we should be asking ourselves, is there a connection between the built environment and economic opportunity? Can we as local governments, can they be setting the table for success in the decisions they make about how we're developing as a community? So we're going to look at transportation, affordable housing, walkability, and incomes. And tonight, my guest and the expert is Andrew Georgiadis. He was a designer with the Urban Design Studio in the city of Sarasota. Also, you headed up the Form-Based Code project in Bradenton,
That's
right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. You are a project manager and urban designer with Plusurbia, but you have also been the protege of people like Andres Swanee and Victor Dover,
Yes,
and
Victor Dover,
Joe Cole. So,
Elizabeth Platter-Zyber.
yeah, these are big names in urban planning, and we are very lucky to have one of their proteges here in Sarasota. You know, when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and we used to say, an expert is someone from out of town with slides. And there's a phrase, you know, you can't be a prophet in your own hometown. And I think it's important for us to recognize the expertise in our midst, and certainly you are one of those people, Andrew. You describe on your profile or LinkedIn, so I'm taking this from there. You use your knowledge of best practices in human-centered urban design and visualizations, combined with experience in streetscapes, rewriting land use regulations, form-based codes, and you deliver sustainable, walkable, and valuable urban places. You also enjoy working on the restoration and conservation of threatened ecosystems and productive landscapes. You've worked throughout the United States and in Saudi Arabia, Montenegro, Russia, the Republic of Georgia, Turkey, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Canada, Brazil, Trinidad, and Tobago. So you bring a wealth of experience. I want to thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to start off tonight asking you to explain a question. When people hear about the Congress of New Urbanism, or urbanism in and of itself, many people think of a city. You know, we think of the term urban and we associate it with a city. But what is urbanism? Is a city always truly urban? And are suburbs, you know, can they be urban? What exactly are we talking about?
Well, when we say urbanism, we really mean the design of the built environment. So urbanism can occur at any scale. And just to give you a little example, which may give you whiplash, you know, the smallest little hamlet in the south of France can be urban. You know, with just 100 houses that are jostled up together so that the neighbors can, you know, share olive oil and bread.
Okay.
Versus Manhattan. Those
Yeah.
are all different types of urbanism. So whatever scale we're working at, we can make a built environment that is good for people and good for them to flourish and be happy and be able to live their lives and have their best life possible.
So why would that hamlet be urban?
So when we look at an urban place, really, a big city is nothing more than a collection of villages, really, or a collection of neighborhoods. And sometimes the buildings are taller, that's true. Mm-hmm. But when we look at the urban qualities, what we look for are, there's 4 or 5 C's: connected, complete, convivial, and of course I'm going to forget that. I always forget it when, embarrass myself.
That's
But
okay.
so what we look at is places that are compact.
Okay.
So they're dense enough to be amenity rich. In other words, they have enough dwelling units per acre so that they can provide the basic needs of life within walking distance.
So there's enough of a customer base
Exactly.
for businesses. So you're talking about a grocery store,
Yes.
clothing, post
Yes.
office. Okay.
A cobbler, a school, all these things that we need just to live.
And employment, and
Yes.
people can walk to their jobs.
Yes.
Okay. So that doesn't have to be a big city.
Right. That can flourish in the tiniest town or hamlet, or just a neighborhood. And then, so we talked about compact, then complete, a range of uses and building types, so that one can have one's life cycle needs met within the same neighborhood without having to move out of it. So aging in place and such. So as we know, our households expand and shrink, and we get married, and then we have kids, and then the kids move out, and our households are constantly in flux.
Mm-hmm.
And so one size won't fit all. So we need a diversity of building types within close range.
Yeah.
And then convivial public spaces where we can all come together and see one another and exchange ideas, and that can be the piazza, it could be the cafe, it could be the street. But we need public spaces. It could be a park. Mm-hmm. And we need a high quality built environment with a good public realm.
Okay, and the public realm would be those places where people socialize.
Yes.
And gather. So I want to put up, I've got just 2 slides, but there is a study, and you can look at this, it was from George Washington University, called Foot Traffic Ahead. And they basically took a look at our urban environment in the United States and took a look at what the impact was on people's lives, how people were doing financially, transportation, things like that. So this is from that study. If we turn around, so we're talking about, what is there a correlation between walkable places and income? And what I took is, I took the very best walkable places in the United States. So on top there's Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, and Seattle. And then I took the bottom. They were the top 30 overall. The bottom, Miami, San Diego, Dallas, Las Vegas, San Antonio, Tampa, Phoenix, and Orlando. So, not very much walkability in the bottom 7 there, or 8. And then lots of walkability in the top 6. And I just want, the audience to take a look. There is a correlation with income. And one of the things from one of the points raised in this Foot Traffic Ahead compendium from George Washington University, they said that the 30 largest U.S. metropolitan areas are home to 46% of our total population, 146 million residents in those 30 metropolitan areas. And according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, these 30 metros account for 58% of U.S. GDP. So what you can see is, we can't say there's causation, right? That hasn't been proven. But there is a correlation. People are making about 60 grand or more, roughly, in these walkable communities. And then it's about a $20,000 difference in income. There's some exceptions. Dallas, they're doing better with 55,000, even though it's not walkable. So I want to ask you, as a planner, I know it's not proven, but what do you think accounts for this difference, if you could say?
It certainly is a complex question. Walkable places tend to retain their value and tend to be revitalized more quickly than places that aren't walkable. So places with good bones, a good gritting place, a collection of historic buildings often, or at least diversity in the building types, enough enough density to have the viable amenities.
Density, we're going to have to, density is, what is density? Because
density
that's
is the number of souls per acre. So basically,
SOULS.
Yes.
The number of people.
The number of people that live or
Okay.
work in a district, and it can be measured different ways. But, and I just wanted to dip down at the bottom of your list actually for one moment. One thing that caught my attention, I was born in Miami Beach and raised in Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And that's considered, an unwalkable metro area. And even within the unwalkable ones, though, if you look at the pockets of where the cities have really flourished and where investment has occurred and where real estate values are strong and there's a diversity of people, those tend to be the walkable pre-World War II areas. So like Coral Gables, Miami Beach, Brickell, Coconut Grove, et cetera, et cetera. For those of you who know South Florida, those tend to be the really phenomenal places. So oasis of walkability in a sea of drivability.
Yeah. Right, and again, in the research I've done, they talk about the difference between walkable urban and drivable suburban.
Yes.
And you mentioned World War II. And that seems to be a dividing line between these two types of development. Can you share what happened there?
Yes. To try to condense where we got derailed as the golden age of American planning, but this is going to oversimplify things probably.
Yeah. Well.
But there were a series of events in the 1930s and then that accelerated in the 40s, and it was a confluence of different ideas. One was zoning, which came about. And zoning was the radical idea that we would create maps and we would separate every single possible activity that humans engage in into different colors and keep each one as far from the other as possible.
Okay.
So we did this in every single city, and we created maps which made all of our lives non-conforming, to use the legal term. And we made sure that we had square miles of just residential, square miles of just commercial, office over here, medical over here.
There was like the birth of the office park. Was that part of it?
Office parks came a little bit after zoning, which was born even earlier in the 1930s, but they wouldn't have been possible without it, and they fit nicely into the diagram, that's for sure.
So everything started to become more separated.
Yes.
Okay, so that kind of brings me to my next slide. I only have two. Okay, so this walkable urban place, when you look at the land use, how much actual acreage in the United States, it's responsible for 58% of our gross domestic product, and yet it's only 1% of the land in a metropolitan area. And then the other spaces, what really struck me here, this walkable urban area, I didn't live growing up in a metropolitan, in a city, but my neighborhood was walkable. I grew up in, until I was 12 in Mamaroneck, New York. I was born in New York City, and then we moved to Mamaroneck when I was 4. And I could walk to the grocery store, I could walk across the street to go to school, we could walk to the ice cream store, that was a big treat. It was, my mom could kick us out of the house and say, go play, and we were okay, but there was a lot of stuff to do that was right outside the door. But it wasn't a city. We thought of it as a neighborhood. And then we moved to a place in, you had to drive everywhere. It was a bedroom. It really changed our lives.
Was it Long Island?
No, it was Upper Westchester County. Yeah. So I want you to talk about, share with us from a planning perspective, what is the difference? Because these walkable uses, they use far less land, but then you've got the city edge and the bedroom communities. And what are the differences from planning perspectives?
Sure.
And income, I guess, too.
So, picking up a little bit on the other definition, a walkable place or a neighborhood, in all the flavors that a neighborhood can have, generally will have a range of housing types. So you would see perhaps detached houses, you would see row houses, garden apartment houses, you would see all sorts of things, within close proximity. A neighborhood, usually at its edges, if you look at the classic American and English diagram, a neighborhood has commercial or mixed-use edges. So sometimes I've seen in the local newspapers when people said, keep commercial out of the neighborhoods. Well, that's a nonsense statement.
Yeah.
Because a neighborhood inherently has other uses other than residential. If it doesn't, it's not a neighborhood.
And that's like the planning definition of neighborhood,
yes,
really.
Yeah.
But people are using neighborhood to describe.
To mean single-family detached houses together.
Yeah, and that is actually not what the term was meant.
Right.
And so, how does bedroom community fit?
So a bedroom community would be more akin to what that definition, which is a place where one sleeps and nothing else. And so it's a place devoid of other amenities. It's a place that generally has one type of house repeated, ad nauseum, so that you were guaranteed to be just like people of your own socioeconomic level, and sometimes the same color of your skin. And it's a very isolating sort of thing that has spread from sea to shining sea. Okay,
and so that would be, back in the 60s, I guess Levittown was one of the first planned, bedroom communities, but really any gated community, many gated communities in Sarasota would fit that description.
They would.
Because they're, you're basically there to just hang out and go to sleep, and then you leave the community to go get anything else done.
Especially those that are in the farther reaches of the eastern county, as we see, the sprawl going east of I-75 now and in other places. So.
And they're associated with sprawl, the term sprawl.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And then,
so how does this hurt people's ability to go up the economic ladder? What gets in the way of opportunity when it comes to this kind of building?
Well, sprawl has so many different economic implications for us, and many of them are negative. Sprawl, as you had mentioned before about bedroom communities, there's the whole phenomenon of drive till you qualify, which means that if you can't afford close to downtown or to work, you keep going farther and farther and farther until you can qualify for the mortgage. And sometimes that entails a commute not in Sarasota as much, but in the big metro areas. We're seeing this in Tampa, in Miami, Los Angeles, Phoenix, where people are starting to tolerate 1 to 2.5 hour each way commutes to Exurbia, where it's not even as benign as Levittown. It's like way out there.
My oldest son got a great job offer. I mean, it was a great salary in LA, and we were talking about it. He's like, "Mom, it's going to take me 2 hours to get to work every day."
Yes.
He's like, I can't do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what, forgive me if I'm jumping ahead here, but the cost of operating and owning a vehicle and driving that many miles is a huge drain on household budgets. So oftentimes when we talk about affordability and about the whole affordability question, we only focus on the cost of the unit and the rental, whether it's for sale or the rental cost.
The monthly housing payment.
Yes.
Okay.
But that is completely an incomplete picture, because we know that because of the sort of urban planning situation that we've set up, we're gobbling up between 25 and 50% of our household budgets on our cars.
So if you're calculating housing, how should they look at it? They should look at the transportation costs too?
Yes, mobility cost and all of that. So when a decision maker, whether that be a city or a county or a regional planning authority, is looking at attacking affordability, you almost have to really look at it as an attack on all different fronts. One is how to reduce mobility costs, how to reduce the housing costs through the free market, and then how to subsidize and add those distortions where needed in order to bring prices down. Because sometimes an intervention is needed on the part of government. Okay,
and so what would that look like? What's a distortion that would make sense?
What that means is that there's a certain amount of incentives that we could provide to the free market and activate the free market to delivering units that are more within reach. I hesitate to use the word affordable because it's no guarantee, but so that relates to our building regulations and inclusionary zoning, for instance, or other types of incentives, or density
Okay,
limits.
so it's still too wonky for me.
Oh,
What is
sorry.
inclusionary zoning?
So forgive
I don't know what that
me.
is.
So in some zoning codes in some cities, you know, in Boston, San Francisco, all have versions of this. A certain percentage of each development is geared toward people of a certain median income. To a percentage of the median income of that metropolitan
So
region.
we've tried to do that here. You're talking about saying to a developer, you can build at this density, but you must have 20%, or is that what you mean? 20% affordable, using a definition,
Right.
Attainable.
Right. So
you know.
attainable, sometimes, like the way we define it in Sarasota, I believe, is between 60 and 120%. Attainable means within reach of 60 to 120% of the median Sarasota County income.
Okay.
And affordable is below that threshold, below the 60%. So each region or city uses their own definition in order to get that strata of costs available to development. And so
Yeah, and so, okay, because I'm thinking Daniel Harages is in the audience, and he's with Strong Towns. He wrote a great article about how affordability is usually not at the front end of a building cycle, but
Usually
the most
not.
affordable, yeah, so the most affordable units are actually the ones, and it makes sense, that have been on the market for, they're older,
yes.
right?
Yes, old building
So-
stock is really key to the whole discussion, as Jane Jacobs famously said in The Death and Life of American Cities.
And what did she said, that the older
Yes.
units are actually the ones that have the lower price tag?
Oftentimes when we look at older building stock, it tends to, mortgages have already been retired on them, and they tend to have been, sometimes the closets are too small for whatever reason. There's some factor that makes them slightly
Less desirable.
price lower per square foot. And so when we demolish sort of mindlessly, older buildings, I'm not saying that sometimes it's appropriate, but when we don't really carefully look at our historic building stock, we could be hurting ourselves in the affordability, delivering the affordable units.
Okay, and what role, so I want to start to get more specific about Sarasota.
Sure.
Right, but so if we're going to be going toward this more compact, walkable model, and we will be talking about Bath and Racket, because that is something that actually has the potential, to be this kind of development. People need to be able to walk to their employment, right?
Yes.
And so how do you fit in? I mean, the hospital is a major employment center, government centers like, the county administration building or city hall. How do you look at that and say, okay, I mean, do you put zoning around those places that encourages affordability, or do you try to encourage employment centers to locate around affordable housing?
Yes to all of the above.
Okay.
So, do you mind if I answer your question, but use a very local example of how zoning is getting in the way?
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
So, are you all familiar with the stretch of South Tamiami Trail around the hospital that Cathy mentioned? So, just let's say between Bahia Vista and Weber Siesta Drive.
Yeah.
So that whole stretch of Tamiami Trail is currently zoned a very hyper-specific type of zone, which is, I forgot the initials. It's been a long time since I read the zoning
a lot of
book.
medical offices.
It's medical office. So
Right.
basically, and then it switches, right before Hillview, it switches to neighborhood commercial where the FedEx and the Goodwill are. But just south of that is where the Christmas tree lot is. And that Christmas tree lot, there's actually an owner who wants to do a mixed-use building with apartments and a trattoria. They're from Sicily.
Oh, wow.
And they want to do a cafe or something,
That'd be
for
great.
the neighborhood, but they can't because their lot is zoned medical office.
Which we don't seem to need.
So
I mean,
you
there's
can
so
sell
many.
an X-ray there, but you can't sell a cappuccino.
Wow.
So
Okay.
the reason is that the market is not able to respond to any of what the demand is as far as housing, commercial, or even other office, non-medical, because zoning had stipulated that there would be a certain supply, never to change ever and ever and ever, at a certain year for those lots. And so they've languished, and we see that there's one after another empty lot right there.
And so they're used to sell Christmas trees one time a year.
So they're sitting on it and they're saying, you know, until we get a zoning that will allow us to accomplish our goals and to do something that's more in line with the needs of the community, we're going to do not much on it right now.
Yeah, you
so
know,
we see that throughout the city.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed is you would think that 41 would be a highly valuable place,
yes.
right? And when they started building storage units on 41,
that's a symptom.
I was, you know, I thought something is wrong.
Yes.
Because they're putting storage units on this thoroughfare. So,
yes.
You have any thoughts about the storage unit thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, storage units are, like you mentioned. That's one of the things where you say, well, it's a red flag, and you say, oh my goodness, what's happening, and what is the zoning? You know, oftentimes you can see something. It's like the Matrix with Keanu Reeves. You know, when you see these, you look behind and you see what are all the green letters that are, you know, coming down. What are all the regulations behind this? You know.
Mm-hmm.
And so with storage units, it's probably the lowest possible use of urban land that one could imagine, save for maybe a parking lot.
I mean, they should be out in the hinterland, really.
Right,
not...
you wouldn't squander precious urban land that could be walkable with that use, you know, which is oftentimes blank and is a blighting influence. So you're absolutely right. And so, you know, there's a lot of demand for housing around the hospital, for instance, where you know, not only doctors but nurses and all the techs, nurses assistants, CNAs. I mean, there's a whole industry of different people that are in need of housing in close proximity to Sarasota Memorial Hospital. And it's very, let's put it this way, the real estate values are very posh around there, and it's very difficult to find that type of housing that we can get some of those employees to be able to live close to work.
But that lot that you're talking about on 41, where the Christmas trees and it's empty, would be a perfect spot.
Right, or even the first, dare I say, the first few lots in, too.
Yeah.
You know, which could be transitional. Why does it have to be single-family detached, low density forever and ever? Whereas those could be row houses or something else that, where you could have a, you know, a nurse or a teacher or somebody else walking to work from there.
Yeah, so what do you say, because I think there's a knee-jerk reaction, and many times I agree with neighborhood advocates. I've been a neighborhood advocate, I've served on the board of my neighborhood association in Kona, and but there's a knee-jerk reaction like, oh no, multi-housing, you know, multi-family housing, that's just, there goes the neighborhood, you know, I don't want it next to my single-family home. How do you respond to that?
Well, first, the presence of a multi-family building or an attached single-family building, such as a row house, because a row house is not multi-family, it's single-family. It just happens to touch a wall. Right. There is no evidence at all whatsoever that the proximity of one to a single-family detached would reduce one's quality of life or values. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary.
Okay.
So I would urge those who have the reflex reaction against housing types that look different from the ones that currently make up the fabric of the neighborhood to really study what the implications are, what they're advocating for. Because, for instance, sometimes we say we're all for affordability, but the moment that the attached dwelling unit is proposed on our street, or the moment that there's, you know, the garden apartment, which has three times the density as our lot happens, we see that there's this reaction against it. And how can we advocate for the diversity and the affordability and all the other goals that we're striving for if we keep having the reflex against higher density housing types?
So, and I want to pull in the Bath and Racket, but before we do that, you know, that development, and then there's, you know, Tuttle and Bay Vista.
Yes.
What's being proposed there is, you know, a lot of apartments, and it is near single family. But transportation.
Transportation.
I know years ago, and this was before I started paying close attention, but I've been told that there was a plan to have a connector bus going from the airport to the hospital, that, you know, the city of Sarasota would benefit from frequent, reliable bus service, and that there was one neighborhood, I think it was down through Osprey, but there was objection to a bus coming through a neighborhood. People didn't want that. And in a way, you know, from where I sit, with, you know, what we're talking about, economic opportunity, transportation does get in the way, or lack of transportation gets in the way of people accessing a greater options when it comes to employment, or even better employment. You know, what's been your experience in dealing with communities, or have you seen, you know, these kind of objections, and how do you speak to that? You know, this kind of a suburban mentality in an urban area where I don't want the bus coming down my street.
Yes. Well, I think it's important to also step back and look at our history. And Sarasota really grew up as a rail town. And I'm not talking about the first wave of immigration, you know, settlers such as maybe Bertha Palmer and the Scotsmen, but I'm talking about immediately the next generation. We already had a lot of rail in the ground. We had a lot of steel wheel coming through Sarasota.
And because there are stops on Main Street, right?
Yes, we had a fantastic station at the end of Main Street, which is now Kane.
That office building.
The office building.
Way at the end of Main Street.
And we had one near Station 400 on Lemon, which was a terminus, and we had yet another. I forgot where it was located, but we had 3 rail hubs in our that connected us to other cities, and that also allowed us to have some shorter trips. So we were a city that was transit rich, and we never had a streetcar system like Tampa is rebuilding now with Ybor City and such, but we did have transit in our blood. And so the whole transit equation, I worry that we also have a reflex against buses, rail, streetcars and such, because I call it our damaging motto. So we say, you know, we're the small town with urban amenities, or
oh yeah, we're a
small town,
a small city with big city amenities. I think they're really talking about the arts.
With the arts, but I've heard that invoked when it's time to tap into the big city toolbox of problems, of solutions. We hear this mentality, but we can't do that because we're just a small town, and that's going to make us seem more like a big city. And the fact is that Sarasota is a place that lassos 55,000 people off season. Yeah. But then it's a place that has 150,000 in season. And then when you look at the communities that actually make up our metropolitan region, such as Bradenton and Manatee County, Venice, the northern reaches of Northport, and you see the size of what we are as a city, as a metropolitan region. Now I'm using the definition of city as functioning metropolitan area. Yeah. We're actually not a small city. No. We're a major force to contend with. Yeah. We don't look, our imagery isn't like that, but we are a major Floridian metropolitan region. A city that deserves the toolbox that big cities use, because if we restrict ourselves to the small city toolbox, we're going to be in trouble. Well,
and I think a lot of people would say we already are when it comes to traffic. It's got, you know, people say every year it's worse, but every year it truly is worse. Yes. And it's usually the short trip, isn't it?
The short trip, right.
Yes. Tell us about that.
So, traffic is a funny thing, because traffic, you know, we all drive, and then we resent when we're competing with that road space with the other people, whether that be the snowbirds or whoever is next to us on the road. And traffic itself, we use a term in the planning profession called VMT, vehicle miles traveled. Because traffic means different things to different people. Some people, when they say traffic, they mean congestion. They mean the ability. They mean they're frustrated because they're not able to.
They're not moving.
They're not moving. It's not flowing. Yeah. Whereas other people, when they say traffic, they mean the total number of vehicles on the system at any one time. Yeah. So there's just different definitions. But one of the greatest things that increases VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is what I mentioned before, is the distance between the trip generators and the generator and the destination.
So the grocery store is far away,
yes.
The post office is far away,
yes.
My dry cleaner,
yes.
All that stuff.
So when you have potential destinations, grocery stores, which account for a large percentage of trips in American households. The presence of a grocery store and the ability to have a lot of dwelling units next to a grocery store is one of the prime things that we could do. One of the greatest weapons we can deploy against traffic.
To reduce traffic. Okay, so Lido, one of the things, you know, that bridge is just horrible in season. And they used to have a pharmacy on St. Armand's. That's gone. And there used to be a convenience store.
Yes.
And Carl Schaafstal, who heads up the Lido Residents Association, is like, you know, that used to help a lot. You could get a quart of milk without leaving the island. Now, you know, you can't. You have to cross the bridge for anything like that. So that's really hurt. Just Lido having a 7-Eleven type, you know, or a little convenience store or deli would be a big help, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and it could be designed beautifully too. It need not look like the typical.
Yeah, it doesn't have to.
Strip 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
So, but that's often the objection to that type of use, is that people are so used to bad design that they can't imagine that it would actually enrich the character of the neighborhood. So when we say they use convenience store, they immediately think, you know, one of the leading brands, you know,
some stop and go,
right?
Yeah, 7-Eleven, which they wouldn't want.
But you're absolutely right. When you look at the land uses on the islands, so in Lido, St. Armand's Key, and Bird Key, which I'm not, you know, I don't want to create a rumor. I'm not saying to put commercial on Bird Key or anything like that. But I'm saying that when you look at the when you look at the land uses, you see that there are a lot of needs that can only be satisfied off island, and so a lot of that traffic can be explained by that, which you would imagine that we could rebalance some of those districts to offer that.
It would actually improve beach accessibility for everyone.
Yes.
If the island dwellers were able, right, to not have to get off the key for any little thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's go now to Bath and Racket.
Okay.
Okay. So we have this example, which is, you know, as you all know, the Bath and Racket Club has like 26 tennis courts, and it's time for it to be refurbished, and they want to create apartments. And they're asking for permission to go from 9 units an acre of apartments to 25 units an acre. And there's a lot of concern about traffic and what that would look like. But yet at the same time, that is an area that it could be really walkable. Trader Joe's is right there. You could, you know, the grocery store correlation that you're talking about. You could create apartments where people could really walk to the grocery store, and you know, if they worked nearby, and the hospital's not really walkable from there, but it's not that far away. So you have some slides, and maybe Annie, you can help us now to just, I would love to get your take on Bath and Racket and what ought to be there, and what, because you know, the neighbors are concerned about cut through traffic. So we could talk about the grid and street design. But again, all of this does speak to helping people live more with more prosperity, right? Not being the slave of filling up the car with a tank, the tank of gas, or not even needing a car, or if they're a family, maybe just needing one instead of two. Yes. So what would that look like with Bath and Racket? If you were the king of Sarasota, what would you do?
Well, also, it's important that I say the disclaimers. I have no involvement in the design or development team at all, or have nothing to gain by advocating for or against different aspects of the design, so I just want to make that clear.
Okay. of that location, too.
Yes. Yeah. So, is it okay if I stand up?
Sure.
Can anybody hear me? Do I need to talk with the microphone?
You might need to take. Okay. You have to take it with you.
Let me see. I'm gonna
make it walkable.
Yeah.
There. Okay. So here is the proposed redevelopment of the Bath and Racket Club. For your orientation, here is Tamiami Trail. This is School Avenue, which comes in like this. Roselawn, I think, is here. Mill Terrace is there, and that's west of the trail, right there. This is right off the screen is the Best Buy and Barnes & Noble Plaza, and then there's a string of restaurants here: Bonefish Grill, Chili's, etc. Trader Joe's, and then this is also little shopping plaza.
Darwin's
and the Thai
little
restaurant.
shops are in there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the proposal is a taller building. If I'm not mistaken, it's 5 stories, which is right behind Trader Joe's in a more courtyard format. This is still the existing Bath and Racquet Club, and then these are tennis courts which are raised up onto a deck, which is covering the parking.
Oh.
I believe. And then these are the existing courts right here at current grade, and then these are shorter buildings which then transition. You see they step down to 2 stories near the rear of the property to relate better to the
Single family homes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is multifamily right here, which goes very deep into the neighborhood, and it occurs rather far from Tamiami Trail, so there's already a precedent for more density embedded right here at the center of the neighborhood.
Okay. So, you know, I mean, what would you say to the neighbor? Because there's a lot of concern about the amount of units, and I can understand that. You know, they're concerned about the roads being overburdened. And is 9 units an acre enough? I mean, that's still a pretty big leap. Should it be 25? I mean, what's your thought?
When you compare districts that have very high quality of life around the country, whether they be in small towns or large cities, the units to acre, for instance, I'll give you an example. There are many parts of the most valuable stretches of Charleston, South Carolina, built at 2 and 3 stories, which are arguably the best real estate in all of South Carolina, and they are at 30 units to an acre.
So, okay.
So density, and they have almost no car traffic.
Because they can walk.
Because they're very walkable.
Okay.
So there is, and this is very hard to say because it seems counterintuitive. There is little correlation between density, units of, dwelling units per acre, and traffic. It's one of the most repeated tropes, but it's not true.
Okay. Okay.
Only if it's in a walkable area.
But even so, it's dense traffic or congestion has more to do with lack of connectivity and block size than any other factor. So
lack of connectivity, meaning the streets are not creating bottlenecks.
Yes. So any density of any human settlement will start to generate traffic if it has insufficient connectivity, even the lowest densities.
All right, so if I'm flying into Sarasota and I see all of these planned communities that have basically one way in and out.
Yes.
And cul-de-sacs.
And cul-de-sacs.
That creates traffic because...
Right. Each household there generates on an order of between 10 and 100 times the amount of vehicle miles traveled than a person living in a grid near the center of town. So when we see fury about an infill building in the grid of downtown Sarasota or in a close to town neighborhood, especially from those who live in the suburban gated community or in a more suburban configuration, those residents are generating 10 to 100 times the amount of vehicle usage than the development located and embedded in the more urban area.
Okay, so by way of example, I used to live in Palmer Ranch.
Yes.
So when I lived in Palmer Ranch, and actually that was my experience, I drove a lot more than now living in downtown Sarasota, even though, frankly, I'm not walking because we live on Golden Gate Point, and that is not actually that easy to walk to the grocery store.
Yes.
But, because I got to cross, these big streets and I'm not comfortable doing that. But that's preferable to the gated community.
Certainly.
Okay, so now...
Yeah, so density is density is fixated upon as the most important metric
Yes,
And
definitely.
it's perhaps one of the least important metrics when looking at quality of life and traffic generation. And I know it's hard to swallow, but that's how it is.
So what is the most important metric when you're looking at traffic?
So when looking at traffic, it's monoculture and it's lack of connectivity. So monoculture meaning swaths of single uses without a diversity of uses or lack of mixture of uses, and lack of grid connectivity or network connectivity.
So bedroom communities with cul-de-sacs versus a grid
Yes.
with some mixes of,
Yes.
of different commercial and residential uses.
Yeah, so there's a whole list of things, and then there's transit accessibility, there's bikeability, and all of that it entails, and then way down after you've analyzed all of those things, units per acre comes into play as a consideration.
Okay. So one of the things, bringing it back to affordability and income and all that, you know, I ran for office in 2010, and it's been a theme since then where people say, our kids can't live here.
Yes.
They leave, you know. There's not enough apartments in Sarasota, and the apartments that we have are expensive.
Yes.
Right? So how would this, how can we get more affordable housing right now?
I'm blocking this.
And how would these denser developments, would they help that problem?
Okay, so can I nerd out and go into the zoning code again?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Not too much.
You can correct me. So let's look at the downtown as an example. We have currently in DTC and DTB, which are the two zoning districts that regulate most of our downtown.
Downtown core
And downtown Bayfront.
and downtown Bayfront.
We have a limit of 50 units to the acre, I believe.
Okay.
And we have a height limit of 10 stories in one and 18 stories in the other. So what that means is that the developer will build to the maximum building envelope, whether that be 10 stories or 18 stories, and then divide that building into a number of units that maxes out the density limit.
Yeah.
And 50 units to the acre will always yield large units, units that are between 1,500 and 5,000 square feet. When you multiply that by the construction value, you're guaranteeing that each apartment, each flat
Expensive.
will be at least $1 million.
Wow. Okay.
When you have a higher density or no density limit at all, you have the same.
You know that would freak everyone out.
You have the same build. You have the same building mass, but you're allowed to divide it up into smaller sized units. So therefore, if they're for sale, the same unit, the unit that's 700 square feet times the per square foot value of construction, either for rent or for sale, will generate an entire different price structure than what we're currently doing.
Okay.
Because right now, our density limits are out of sync with our building massing metrics. There's a disconnect in our zoning code that is guaranteeing that each apartment will be unaffordable. Not even attainable, only for the affluent.
Wow. I've never heard that explained like that. Okay. So we have a structural problem with zoning in the city.
Yes.
That's going to inevitably result in unaffordability.
Well, at least thwart it.
Toward it. Okay.
Thwart it. It will make
Thwart
it.
it,
It'll make
okay.
it more difficult or work against it.
So what would you do if you see Sarasota, you know, there's potential with the Bath and Racket development. You've got this idea of putting multifamily housing near grocery, right?
Yes.
Are there areas that you look to that you'd say, wow, that'd be a great space for some, you know, more dense and multifamily housing? What do you see when you look around?
So when looking for places where development like this could land, you look for corridors which can be upgraded to better transit service in the future, like Tanaimi Trail. You look for the presence of grocery stores, schools, places of employment, and other amenities that already can start to reduce your car trips or eliminate them entirely. And you look for transitional spots between lower density single family housing perhaps, and purely commercial that faces the corridor. So this is one of the sites that is the classic, poised for this type of redevelopment.
Okay, so Bathroom, could you see any others?
There are many throughout the city, yes.
Okay. The Tuttle Bay Vista?
Yes, and that's not saying that I agree with all of the design characteristics of any of these, but it's just that when you talk about places for additional reinvestment and redevelopment, many of them are really well located for that.
But the thing is, they have to include this commercial element, don't they? I mean, if the grocery isn't there, like I'm thinking Tuttle and Bay Vista.
It suffers from that.
A deli and a dry cleaner, and it could be different. But right now, it's just going to be a place for. I don't see any commercial, right?
Right, and that proposal does suffer from that. But the zoning also is hostile to mixture of uses. So once again, the zoning, which has a very restrictive permitted use chart, doesn't even allow for it. So even if there were the ability to have a corner bakery there that the residents could walk to, it would be not legal to do so.
Yeah, and I remember very fondly growing up in this neighborhood where we had access to like mom and pops, and even, it was a chain grocery store at the end of the street, but it wasn't huge, but it had everything, Christides at the name. But it certainly wasn't considered, it wasn't considered. It wasn't a low rent area. It was a great area, and these places were charming.
Yes.
How do you talk to residents and change these perceptions, to allow for the mixed use? And it's a big mountain to climb. You've got to change zoning, but you've got to introduce this idea to citizens that this will work and actually enhance your life instead of make it worse. I mean, we don't seem to be having a very successful community conversation about that, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if we would win over everybody, and not every place is suitable for that type of mixed-use development, but where it is suitable, I think we have to make the argument that there are so many benefits. It's not only to the environment, it's to our bottom line, it's, to the tax base. It's, we're polluting less because we have less tailpipe emissions, and we're healthier because
we're walking
in the bonds of community. Centenarians, there's a reason why the centenarians live in around the Mediterranean basin and in parts of Japan and in other places like that. It's because they live in very social, convivial type environments where they can walk to the tea house in Japan, or the corner cafe in Sardinia, or the olive mill in Greece, and they get together with their neighbors.
My friend has her dad is in his 90s in Israel, and he has the barber shop downstairs and all of his friends. He's got his apartment, and he's really good. That aging in place is really working for him.
Cathy, sorry.
Yeah. We have to go to questions.
But we have somebody in the audience.
Sure.
Oh, well, thanks. Andrew, could you address something of great concern to me, is the role of parking regulations in an area that's urbanizing, and yet the kind of the parking regulations add to the bulk, they add to the cost, and there should be a trade-off between density and the amount of space that the storage of parking affects the design and affordability, a lot of other things. But I think the city has not addressed that issue.
You're absolutely right. The cost of parking can add a tremendous amount to the cost of the unit or to the municipal budget, depending upon who's paying for that parking space. So when you look at a developer paying it, let's say it's in structured parking, we may be thinking of $20,000 to $60,000 per parking space, depending upon how elaborate the structure is. And in some cases, the 60,000 is the, a rare urban environment. But here we're definitely in the tens of thousands of additional costs per unit. And so because we have ratios that are always so suburban, even in areas that could be walkable. In other words, what I mean by that is that in our codes it says for every unit you have to have 2 spaces. Then you have to have visitor spaces and a coefficient of XYZ, and before you know it, the whole thing's parking.
Yeah.
So we have gold-plated infrastructure for the storage of automobiles. And
That's a lot of money.
And we cannot bring down the cost of the unit. And there are many good examples of building types like assisted living facilities which have a lower ratio, but there are also just run-of-the-mill residential buildings which could be marketed or could be geared toward people that have 0 or maybe 1 car per household, and that could function very well at a much lower ratio, and then also put that towards reducing the either the for sale or the for rent housing cost. So what you said is very true. And then when we talk about municipal funds spent on parking storage, we're looking at all of the elaborate parking garages. And so, you know, every 5 years we get together as a city and we say, what am I going to spend $20 million on? I know, parking, you know, it's automobile storage. And I say that not to make fun, because I was involved in the State Street garage and I was happy to do that. And so I don't want to poo-poo it, but you know, I wish that I had been designing something else except for automobile storage. And I used my energy just to do this pretty box for cars.
Yeah.
And I wish I had dedicated my year of life to do something else. And so I wonder, like, you know, we just did a beautiful one. Jonathan Parks is my hero, and so please, if you're listening, I'm not criticizing your parking garage on Lido. I love you, Jonathan. But what I'm saying is that why is it that we decide that there's no better use of our $20 million every 10 years than another automobile storage?
Parking garage. Yeah, and tell us about, because when you were at the Urban Design Studio, you found that there were ways to kind of reorganize and restripe the current parking to get many more spaces in the city.
So what makes this even more tragic as a policy is that we have created an artificial scarcity of parking spots through the city by our street design.
Okay.
What I mean by that is the the default condition of most urban streets should be parallel parking at the curb. This is how all classic American cities developed. At first it was just a carriage waiting spot. But in Sarasota and other American cities, we've de-striped or erased out of existence scores and dozens and hundreds of parking spaces that were easy to create and that used to exist at the curb. And then we declared that we have an emergency and a scarcity, and that at the cost of several $million a pop, we create the garages to house those cars that could have just parked along the curb.
So give us an example. I mean, I can't really tell how we've eliminated so many. What's happened?
There are many. So let's look at, I'll give you one example. One is there is a frontage road, Gulfstream Avenue, which parallels the Bayfront in downtown. South of Ringling, Gulf Street, north of Ringling, all the way to the well beyond Main Street, past Coconut. You notice that there's reverse angle parking in Gulf Street. South of Ringling, towards Selby Gardens, for a distance of more than 1,000 feet, all of it was removed a generation ago, and it's just a piece of asphalt right now. So hundreds of spaces
that could be there are gone because there was a discomfort of having other people park in front of some of those buildings. Okay.
If you look at Orange Avenue, for instance, just north of Mound Street, Orange Avenue, until you get to the Triangle Building and the Women's Exchange, there's no on-street parking. The on-street parking starts only there. South of Orange, it's 5 or 6 lanes of fast-moving traffic, and it's very uncivilized how fast it is. So all of that used to be parallel parking. And if you look block after block in the city, there has been an erosion of the on-street parking, creating this false scarcity.
And the parallel parking actually slows down the traffic.
Parallel parking slows down traffic. So one of the most important aspects to note about parallel parking is that it creates a psychological distress in the driver. And that's a good thing. So when we see the parked car at the side of the road, it narrows the apparent roadway width. It narrows the amount of asphalt that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So our eyes are seeing this visual friction, and our brains immediately start to say, oh no, what if somebody opens a door?
I better be careful.
And so you tend to go 5 miles per hour slower. And so all of these things, your brain is subconsciously reacting to the increased friction in the perceived narrowing of the roadway. And you're driving in a more civilized manner, in a way that if you were, God forbid, to strike a pedestrian, you're likely to maybe injure rather than kill that person.
Because your speed is less.
Yes, because below 20 miles per hour, the injuries tend to be not fatal. Above 20, 25, they tend to be fatal.
Yeah.
So anything we can do to reduce design speeds by increasing that visual friction, we're helping reduce the amount of fatalities and injuries on our
And we are
roadways.
like the worst state. And
Yes.
actually, our metropolitan area is one of the top in the nation
Yes.
for pedestrian and cycling fatality and
Yes.
injury. So I did want to get back to affordable housing, accessory dwelling units.
Okay.
And this is another, oh my God, there goes the neighborhood reaction that people have.
Yes.
Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are the granny flat, like
Yes.
they're converted detached garage into a little apartment in someone's backyard. And, I have a friend who lost her husband recently, and she was saying, what a difference it would make in my life if I could put a little apartment in my yard and sell out, rent the house. I could stay in my neighborhood, I could be comfortable, and I could have some income as well. But when these things are proposed, people really, in neighborhoods, they really usually have big reactions against them. And I'd just like you to respond to, do they work? Do they make a big difference? What are the benefits, and what are the risks of allowing that kind of development?
Yes. So accessory dwelling units have been legislated out of existence in a lot of neighborhoods across the country. And as you mentioned, the presence of the ability to have an accessory dwelling unit provides affordability benefits to not only the homeowner, but also to the renter or the one who inhabits the space, at low cost or free, if it's, let's say, it's a generous
The mother-in-law
relative.
suite.
Right.
Yeah.
And increasingly we're seeing that households, we call them mother-in-law suites or granny flats, and in the past it used to be that, but now it's starting couples that are starting off, or the teenager that you just want slightly farther away from the main wing of the house, or
Young adults getting a start in life. Yeah.
All sorts of different people can inhabit an accessory dwelling unit. And start to balance out and round out the household's financial bottom line as well. And so oftentimes the angst comes from the additional parked cars. It goes back to the cars, because
really?
There's a worry about, are we going to see our neighborhoods now strewn with double the amount of vehicles that we used to have? So it's funny because it goes back to human psychology, because I've lived in neighborhoods which were slightly denser and which had a curb, and then it was not offensive to see cars parked along the curb. But when we have a lack of a curb and maybe a swale, it seems then that the cars are intruding somehow on the street space.
Yeah, so the swale is kind of like a little divot by the road.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, and so again, bringing that, I'm thinking about beach parking. One of the things that I consider with beach parking is the streets are not private.
Streets are not private, and people often say, why are people parking on my street?
Yeah.
The streets are a public infrastructure,
I mean, I
public
pay
resource.
for everybody,
Right.
we're all paying for those streets.
Yes.
And people need to behave. I mean, I think accessory dwelling units, it's always this social concern about behavior and noise and all of that. But in reality, if I'm paying for that street, why shouldn't I be able to park on it?
Yes. For instance, in Arlington Park, which is my own neighborhood, for instance, there was a well-known doctor on Wisteria and Tam, 'Tam, 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 and the neighbors got together and they petitioned the city for no parking signs. So now there's a no parking sign between Tamiami Trail and East Avenue, so that it's illegal now to do so, even for their own guests.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
this is one of the things where we're so threatened by the presence of another person or another vehicle in our, you know, in our
realm,
in our realm,
neighborhood.
even
Yeah.
though it's a public street. It's somewhat baffling.
Yeah. Well, I did. You know, we had one question.
Yes.
Does anybody want to ask Andrew?
Are you familiar with the RF6 and RF7 that they're on the cusp of approving now?
Forgive
One
me.
is 25 units per acre, and I think the other one is.
So let's repeat the question.
Was I aware of the RF6 and RF7 zoning districts,
Maybe it's
which are being
RF1.
contemplated?
Yeah, they're about to finalize approval, and this has to do with ability to create affordable housing. And
Forgive me, I'm ignorant because I haven't followed the latest in the Sarasota zoning code. But can you educate me?
I was hoping you would educate me.
Okay.
Roughly, I think that, and that's the battle in our neighborhood, is at the corner of Bahia Vista and Tuttle, is there's the Arlington Commons that's proposed, and they were seeking a comprehensive land use change to have 253 units there, and to get approval for RF7, which has not been accepted into the code yet.
Oh, I see.
So it was a difference between, I think, 25 units per acre. I may have the numbers wrong, but it's like one is double of the other, and it's quote unquote attainable, affordable housing.
Yeah.
Whatever it is on any given day.
Yes.
Workforce attainable, affordable.
So Virginia has identified some very interesting topics, and once again, I'll try not to go too far down to the weeds, but what many people don't realize is that there are two books that are regulating density and development regulations. One is the comprehensive master plan, and the other is the zoning. And so many, so that particular redevelopment site is not only seeking a rezoning, am I correct, Virginia, but it's also seeking comprehensive land use change, which is another map which says all of the different zoning districts you're allowed to rezone to, that you could even contemplate. So in this case, they're trying to rezone to a zoning district which is still not on the books. Am I
Yes. They want to make a big change, both at one time. Yeah. But you know, and I'm going to jump in because, no, it's okay. If it's okay to add this, again, for me, it goes back to, if you know, you got to talk to the neighborhood about how this is going to enhance their life. And that conversation is missing. And for whatever reason, the development community or, you know, or the city policymakers don't get in there and say, look, you know, we're gonna allow this kind of commercial there. We promise, you know, that was what form-based code was supposed to be about. Yeah. You were gonna see what design was gonna be allowed. It wasn't gonna be something that looked tacky or, you know, bring down the neighborhood. Something you could be excited about. Oh, I'd like to get a cappuccino and a croissant, drop off my dry cleaning, get a gallon of milk, you know, and that's missing. It seems like we get into these big fights, and so density's bad. They don't advocate and do the work to create mixed use or sell the idea and understand, like, this is actually how our grandparents grew up. This is Main Street, USA. Why aren't we, you know, why that disconnect?
Well, I do think that, you know, density, as Virginia had said before, density without design can be a problem too, because not only is it not palatable to the neighbors because they can't understand how it could be an improvement, but also there's also maybe a lack of communication with the neighbors. And one example from that Tuttle project, and once again my disclaimer, I'm friends with Chris Gallagher and the rest of the architectural
with everyone I know
team, and I respect them, you know, and so I'm not at all criticizing their work, but there's a parking garage, for instance, on that property, and it faces Loma Linda, and it faces two sides of the Euclid and Loma
And
Linda.
this is the medical buildings that are, it was the old site of the old doctor's hospital.
Yes.
And there's still medical offices there.
And that parking garage is about 35 feet from the front parcel boundary, from the sidewalk. So one of the first things that I would do if I were king, which would be to line that parking garage with villas or row houses that would face the houses across the street.
Oh.
So that you wouldn't be staring at a 4-story parking garage forever and ever, but you would be looking at windows and balconies and
Neighbors.
dooryards and stoops and new neighbors in beautiful houses. There's no reason, aside from having to do some site engineering to remove the retention pond that's now in front of the garage to the back, that you can't do that and present a very human face to that parking garage, and one would even know it's a parking garage, after this is done. So, missed opportunity, and I, once again, love you guys, but we need to have a higher design standard for things like that, because maybe, just maybe, we would have won some of those hearts over, some of those neighbors, if we had shown them a drastic improvement in their street scene.
Yeah.
From blank parking garage walls to looking at, villas and balconies and stoops and windows.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't have reduced all of the angst and frustration and controversy in the neighborhood, but some would be won over by a compelling image like that.
Yeah.
So.
Is there any? I don't want to hog him.
Yes.
Tom and then Tom and then Francis.
Yeah, I'm thinking. I live in East County, so I'm thinking, of course, about the large gated communities that have been going in there,
yes.
And some of the ones that are planned are even larger, like High Hat Ranch and
yes.
Skyway. The logic of what you're saying, even about this health racket club, of having a mixed use and walkability, seems to escape the people who are planning these large-scale developments. What kind of intervention might require, or at least push planning in the county in the direction of having walkability, having fewer needs to get in a car and go somewhere?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Though it was imperfect, there was actually a very good chapter of the Sarasota County Comprehensive Plan on the books, and it was 2050. And it was on the books for what, a whole decade. Mm-hmm. And it was geared toward delivering walkable towns and hamlets rather than suburban sprawl. And I say it's if my friend Peter Katz is listening, I'm not criticizing you, Peter, because it had a few warts, but warts and all, it was much better. It had a high standard for development, and there was a fiscal neutrality component of it, which would require that it was more than concurrency. It was showing that the development had to pay for itself before certain development approvals were awarded.
Yeah, because when you talk about, in my introduction, you care about creating valuable development.
Places.
And walkable development. We haven't talked about this,
yes.
But it does speak to the prosperity of the community.
Yes.
Walkable development generates enough tax revenue to pay for its
yes.
infrastructure and service needs. It actually generates, like a surplus. The city of Sarasota generates a disproportionate amount of the county revenue because it's more high-value development per acre, and they're getting more taxes from it. And if I may, just to give an example, and Daniel Herriges, I don't know if he's still here, but Strong Towns, there was an example, and they showed a very small neighborhood storefronts, 4 storefronts next to each other, and they were old, and like one had a barber shop, and one had a little shoe store, and mom and pop businesses, right? Yes. And there were 4 of them. And then the other was a drive-through like Popeyes, something like that.
Chuck Marone's presentation.
Yes. Right. And they asked the audience, which of these is more high value to the community? And a measurement of value is the property tax, right? Because, and people would think it's always the drive-through. It's always the fast food restaurant because it was new and it was like bigger, and it's the 4 individual storefronts. And the point he made was that it's like a diversified financial portfolio. These 4 storefronts could be anything. They set the table for small businesses to come and prosper, you know, in a community, and they actually are generate more value. And that fiscal neutrality element in 2050 was designed to require the high value development, which is what you focus on.
And the threshold was so high that it was the developer juggernaut, you know, was arguing with the county commission, saying that it was evidence of its failure because no one had built anything under 2050. But I would submit that it was evidence of its success because it was so 2050 was so good at keeping out sprawl from being developed that nothing was getting approved because we hadn't seen any proposals that really resembled a walkable town, and so nothing had been built, and they said it's a failure. No, it's a success.
So if it's more of a mindset issue, because it sounds to me, and I mean, I want to know if this is correct to your question, that walkable communities can be built. And they are productive, and they enhance incomes and economic opportunities for residents in the environment and our health. There's all these benefits. But from the business, this is the role of government. From the business standpoint, if that's not what you're used to building, you're not going to build it, and you're gonna lobby against it. It's not what you're comfortable with. Is that all that it is, or?
I hate to say, but yeah, you're right. There is a lot of laziness that explains some of this, and there's also walkability has become an exotic thing, as you just said, and so when reviewers see it, when financiers see it, who are used to financing suburban sprawl in monocultures, they don't know how to process the diagram. They look at it and they say, well, where's your strip mall?
Yeah, actually,
where's your office park? And they short circuit when you say, well, no, it's everything.
That was a criticism because they were saying the banks won't. The banks won't fund it.
There's so many obstacles, so much inertia because the whole machine is so well oiled and geared at delivering sprawl, suburban sprawl, and only that, from the financiers to the designers, to the engineers, to the regulators who are approving, that when they see this, what used to be commonplace, which is walkable mixed-use urban fabric, when they see it come in, it looks like this exotic thing, and it's threatening. It's on the paper. They don't know what to do with it.
But okay, so have you seen places where they've gotten over that threshold? You know, they've gotten over their hurdle. Like what Tom's saying, there's an intervention. You know, do we sit down? How do we do that? I don't know.
Well, yeah, there's many metropolitan regions that have started to say they're going to also infill in the urbanized areas walkably, but they're also going to allow for development at the hinterland in the suburban areas, but in a walkable format. So, for instance, I was on the team with Dover Coal Partners that rewrote the El Paso Comprehensive Plan, which was working at a metropolitan scale. So a lot of desert Southwest cities are starting to, they have a lot of development pressure. So Phoenix, Tucson, El Paso, they're all starting to look at new ways to encourage walkable oases in their suburban areas. Miami has started both by reforming its code and also by in the county has started to, at the edge of the Everglades, promote oases of walkability, which used to be only bedroom communities, you know, so there's a shift is occurring.
I want to
yes.
Me?
Yes, please.
I just want to touch on a couple points. One is, for example, when you're talking about decorating the back of the building on, you know, down at Tuttle and behind this.
The parking garage?
Yeah. And I thought that was so joyful because I used to live in northern England, like 250 miles north of London, so,
yes.
You know, and those communities were built on water and mills.
Yes.
And they were there for 150 years. And what we did to help change that was the river was like terrible. The Calder River, you couldn't stand close to it. And when some of the mills became derelict and, you know, creativity in that manner moved upscale into electronics and elsewhere, they were vacant. And so they got turned into real estate. They got turned into apartments and things like that, and condominiums. And what they did is they turned the front window to the river. And we found when the people faced the river, it became real. And
Yes.
they decided they wanted change.
They
Yes.
wanted to clean up the river.
Right. And then finally the river became an important point. And when the river started to clean up, of course, then the conurbation, small as it was,
Yes.
5,000 ton city, 5,000 ton city, you know, became habitable and had this generic outgrowth. So
Yes.
I just want to touch on that because I think that's really brilliant from my own experience. And driving around the area, I noticed, for example, I live on North Orange, so if you go up to where Pines is and come back towards 10th Street, they bought a big piece of property there, and they flattened it out, and they're going to build on there someday. That's forward-thinking investment.
Yes.
And one of the wise things I noticed they did is, after clearing it up and so forth, and they put a fence in, they put bushes and trees along Orange.
So we need
Instead of
some
it being just this
nature.
blah field,
Yes.
they actually made it interesting and pretty so people didn't get pissed off.
Yes. Yes.
So,
There's that, but I want to finish with the
okay, because we
walkability.
have another, yeah.
That's fine. Yeah.
That's fine.
I'm sure they'll be alive in a minute.
Yeah.
I think, and I can say this because I live 5 minutes walk from here, so I do walk. I intentionally moved in this area, so, right. But I think walkability and walking and willingness to walk is overblown in reality. I see so few people walking, and so many people are happy to drive in their car up to Publix to get a quarter or half gallon. Now, I don't know that there really is a viability in walking because I don't see people walking in enough volume to say that it's walkable.
Well, it's not walkable yet.
It's
not walkable enough. But remember, walkability, by shortening the distances between destinations,
Yeah.
it's actually benefiting the driver as well, because when we shorten that pathway between grocery store and home, or between office and school, or between whatever the two uses are, it's making it possible to walk or to bicycle, but it's also reducing the amount of petroleum that is going through our car engines too. And
I don't
so,
disagree with that. I just, what do we do in the summertime? It's just a walkable community.
Well, that has
95 degrees up.
that has to do with comfort and shade, and that's trees.
It counts.
And we
Yes.
need that, right?
Yeah, that's a whole.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Well, maybe.
But you're right.
But walkability does
And not
have to be
everybody,
comfortable.
and not everybody will walk. We're not saying that it will guarantee that all trips will not be made by car anymore. But what we're saying though is that we do have some low-hanging fruit, and we know that we could persuade or entice some people out of the cars sometimes. And even that small percentage can have a drastic effect on their quality of life, their health, and their budget.
Are you thinking long term?
So I'm just going to say, we've got
Yeah.
person
Yes.
Doug
Yeah.
back in.
Yeah, David Lowe with the Rosemary
Oh, David,
District.
I'm sorry.
One question about impact fees. I live in a neighborhood that's tripled in population in the last 5 or 6 years, and our neighborhood, the district, has contributed about $1.5 million in park impact fees, but we don't have a park. We've contributed about $5 million in multimodal fees, and there's been precious little infrastructure, streetscape, and so forth. Are you familiar with other cities where you've worked where there's a nexus test of the reasonableness of where those fees come from, that there's some payback, if you will, within the local neighborhood rather than it going 20 miles away? The ordinance says it may be spent, kind of anywhere in the city, but as a matter of fairness and reasonableness, is there some cases that you're aware of where there's a legal basis or a precedent basis on which if you don't have a park and you put this money in the park impact fee that you should get some attention? Hope this is clear.
I understand your question, but I can't supply with you a precedent for one in which dollars are encouraged to be spent to benefit the neighborhood that is doing the paying. So
Yeah,
I wish
I
wish I could give you some
dollar for dollar reinvestment in your community.
We're not looking for, I think we're reasonable people and we seek to spread it around, but not a dollar of this $7 million has been invested in our neighborhood. And it's just, I didn't know if you had any awareness of other areas where you've worked where this kind of issue has come up, and any solutions or way for the public to kind of approach those municipalities to address this?
Well, I've seen before city-county, interlocal agreements, but I've never seen one occurring at the level of the district or the neighborhood, to be honest with you. But I'm not saying it may exist, I just may be ignorant of it.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
It's like squeaky wheel. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much.
We always learn a lot. This particular project, the Bath and Racket one, is going to be discussed by the City Commission on February 3rd, I think. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I want to, appreciate you shedding some light on how these things can be counterintuitive and how our built environment does impact. I want to bring it back to the most vulnerable in the community who are struggling to make ends meet, and what can we do to encourage and improve life for everybody here. Transportation, I think maybe getting out of this idea that the street belongs to me and I don't want a bus, that accessory dwelling units in my neighborhood could actually create financial benefit to neighbors and financial security. And, we need to be a little more open-hearted and willing to consider change. So I know you're one of the best people I know who explains that, so thanks.
Thank you so much, Cathy, for this opportunity.
Okay, appreciate you all being here.